Hello guys, welcome to virtual event of SUGHYD, where I and Vishal Kera co-host this event. And today we have George Chang, who will be speaking on topic styling with Headless SXA and XM Cloud. Over to you, George. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate you all joining this evening. And thank you to the organizers for organizing this. So today I want to talk about CSS and styling with Headless SXA and XM Cloud. Um, and yeah, so let's get started. So just as an introduction, my name is George Chang. I am based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I've been a developer and an architect for the past 20 years. I don't do as much development work today now as much as I did, but I still like to kind of mess around in the code when I get a chance. I've also been a Sitecore MVP for the past 8 years. So to begin with this, I want to talk about kind of what our options are for modern CSS, because how we do development in the headless world today with Insight Core is different than how we used to do development work with our traditional with web forms or ASP.NET MVC or even SXA. So I want to take a look at kind of what our options are for CSS in this kind of new world of uh, headless site core development. So to start out, we have our regular old CSS, right? This is the kind of standard CSS that we all know and love. So with this, everything is globally scoped. So you can scope down to anywhere in your DOM. And because it's a common foundation, this is the kind of CSS that everyone kind of knows and uses. It's easy to pull in libraries and other code and components into your code without a whole lot of work. You can also use Sass, which is a framework that's kind of built on CSS that adds a lot of enhanced functionality. Things like nesting and mix-ins, variables. But even the regular CSS spec over the past few years has improved a lot. So a lot of that functionality kind of comes out of the box. And I don't know how much you can see that little code snippet on the right, but basically that's kind of a sample, CSS for a sample component that you put together, and you have a body and a header, and it's all nested. This is all in Sass, and so you get some mix-ins and some variables. So anyone who's ever kind of worked on front end generally knows this very, very, very well. Next, another option that we have is what's called CSS and JS. Basically, this has multiple flavors. So there's one built into Next.js, and it's called Style JSX. But basically, this defines your CSS in JSX, right? So you get a style tag in JSX, and you put all your CSS for that component in there. And if you can see on the right side, there's that sample component again. It's the same sample component with the same kind of markup and CSS, but this one is done in Style JSX. So Style JSX isn't the only one, but there are other popular ones. Styled components is another big popular one. Emotion is a kind of slightly older, more popular one. But basically, the gist of this is that you define your CSS as part of your JavaScript function. And the benefit of this is that it's scoped directly to your component. So that means you can have multiple components and you can share the same class name. It's not recommended, but you could potentially have the same class name and they could have completely different styles because that class is scoped directly to that component. And they'll never conflict with each other. They'll never override with each other. CSS and JavaScript also keeps everything, you'll notice, keeps everything together in one file because it's in the function of your component. It's nice for kind of self-contained components that are all together in one file, all in one function. So you have one place to go for that. All right, so then there's CSS modules. So this also works out of the box with Next.js. And this is sort of similar, sort of a mix of the first two in the sense that you have a separate CSS file or Sass file. You could use Sass here as well, just like how you normally have CSS in JavaScript. But you import it in as that CSS file as a JavaScript module. And so this kind of allows you to keep your CSS separate, and take all the advantages of kind of plain CSS and all your workflows and tools and everything. But you're able to keep your styles components. You can still keep your styles component scoped to that component. So you used to get the same advantage of your styles not conflicting with one another. You could have two potential styles with the same name, but because they're in different components, they don't conflict with one another, and they don't override one another. But you still get to keep your styles kind of separately from the component, from your component code. And then lastly, we have kind of what's the new kid on the block, what's really popular nowadays, which is Tailwind. And so the premise of Tailwind is that basically this framework, it's a bunch of utility classes, and every CSS property that you have is a set of utility classes related to that CSS property. And so you never actually have to write CSS. You just use all the utility classes that Tailwind provides you, and you put them in your class. You put them as your class properties in your DOM. So you can imagine this. If you've ever written a lot of CSS before, you get some classes with a lot of properties, and that means your class properties on your DOM can get really, really long and really, really out of hand. But generally, if your components are properly scoped and properly architected, it's not too bad. And then additionally, there are some other libraries out there that help you manage the length of some of those class properties, especially when it comes to responsive, because you basically have to if you want to define one style for one screen size and another style for another screen size, that's two different properties on your class. So you could start with just 7 properties for your desktop, but then you add 5 more for your mobile, and then 4 more for a medium-sized screen, right? And it can really get out of hand. So there are some libraries that help manage that as well. But basically, since the classes are defined on each element, it makes them really hard to overwrite, because it almost acts like a little bit like if you were to use a style tag on DOM, right? Because it's the styles are directly defined, and because you don't really cascade much down, you can't really override the styles very easily, which could, and then the other side of this is, like, if you want to have conditional styles. So if you're saying, I want it to look this way, and this when it's in this state, or this red in this state and then blue in this state, you have to use some conditional JavaScript conditionals to be able to put the correct classes on in order to style it correctly based on what condition you're trying to achieve. For some scenarios, this is actually a good thing that you can't override styles, and everything is kind of locked in, because for example, if you're using a component library, for instance, if you're building a component library, I guess, if you don't want people to override the styles, you want the styles of your components in your component library to always look the same. This might be an effective use case for this, where it makes it less easy for someone to accidentally, change a component in your component library. If your brand color is green, someone accidentally overrides all the buttons to make them purple. Like that's less likely to happen, because you have that kind of green color directly on your component. All right, so you may be asking, which one of these is best? What should I be using? And really, it's kind of up to you and your needs and your requirements. For some people, I just kind of mentioned Tailwind, might be great for component libraries. For some people, it may make more sense that their CSS is kind of tucked in with their components. So maybe CSS and JS makes more sense. Maybe there's a lot of dependency on external libraries that have plain CSS, and so maybe just you're stuck using plain CSS or CSS modules. So it very much depends on your needs and kind of what you're using and what makes the most sense for you and your team. So that's kind of the CSS side of this. I wanted to start talking about the SXA side of this, which is the Sitecore side of this. And for those of you who aren't familiar, SXA is Sitecore Experience Accelerator. And so SXA, or Sitecore Experience Accelerator, has been around for quite a while. It used to be an add-on for XP. And basically, it's a framework for is kind of an opinionated framework for how you do Sitecore development and how you structure items in Sitecore. And there's a lot of built-in niceties of things that you typically have already. But for today, I want to cover Headless what's called Headless SXA, which is what's what's being used for SXA in a headless fashion, right? And so if you've used regular SXA, headless SXA is a lot of the good parts of kind of regular SXA, right? So things like page and partial designs, site maps, you know, error handling, things of that nature. A lot of those kind of come out of the box, but things like you know, all the out of the box components, you know, the theming and everything, all those parts go away because that's all going to be part of your head application. This is also the default structure in XM Cloud. So anytime you spin up a new site in XM Cloud, it's all on headless SXA. So it's good to kind of understand how this works. But if you're not working in XM Cloud, it's also available in XM, or in actually just XP, not necessarily XM, because SXA only works with XP. And so if you're hosting your own headless instance, you can run Headless SXA there as well. So how styling used to be done with regular SXA, you might be familiar with this, is this idea of themes. And so themes were how kind of regular or legacy SXA managed front-end assets, CSS and JavaScript files for SXA components and SXA functionality. And all these files were stored in the media, or all these themes were stored in the media library, and the files were stored in the media library as well. And so each theme has their own set of front end assets. Whatever you created your site, you would basically assign or include the themes that you wanted as part of your site. So depending on what components you used, you'll see kind of that there's a quick list of them on the right. There's quite a few of them. If you were using you know, the Google Maps connector, right? You would include that thing. If you were using the regular, the Maps component, you would include that thing. If you were using search, you would include that thing. So it was basically pulling in all the things that you need as part of your site. So yeah, I mean, many times you basically get a theme per feature or a theme per component, which means that anytime you load your page, you're going to wind up loading 10 or 15 CSS and 10 or 15 JavaScript files every time you load a page, right? And so it was pretty heavy. All the themes are based on jQuery. They're basically extensions of existing kind of jQuery functions. So you really couldn't use a lot of modern JavaScript like React or Vue or anything here without a lot of work, and it just wasn't very efficient. But fortunately, with Headless SXA, this isn't applicable anymore. All your styles are in your head application, and then we don't even have to worry about that. This is great news. We don't have to worry about any of the kind of SXA themes. But there is one theme in here called the grid theme that we have to take notice, because SXA has a grid system. And so if you've used XM Cloud or you've used regular SXA on XP, you'll know that SXA provides the functionality for content authors to come in and add a component and then decide, how wide a component lives, on the 12 column grid, how many columns it takes up, and move it around if there's any offsets, different widths for different screen sizes from a responsive perspective. And so this is that one piece of functionality that crosses the line between your head application, the styles in your head application, and the CMS, because the content authors have access to this, right? And so, your head application has to be able to support this. This is all done by CSS classes, depending on how what a content author picks. Particular CSS classes get added in to your head application. So in SXA, there's a handful of standard grids, and so basically this has come along from years of SXA. So it started with Bootstrap 3 and 4, and then as time moved on, when Bootstrap 5 released, that came in there. Foundation and Grid 960 were some older ones that always kind of remained around. Tailwind is a newer one that got added in, but you have several options of built-in grids. So Tailwind is kind of the newest one. It was added to XM Cloud, and then some of the more recent 10. I think it's 10.2, 10.3 maybe, that it was added into XP. But basically, these are all basically the CSS libraries that you can use for SXA to define these grids, and then it will load in that CSS library for this. For the most part, the components in kind of regular SXA were using Bootstrap anyways, and so it wasn't a big deal to load in Bootstrap. I think by default, Bootstrap 5 was the default grid theme for quite some time. And so now, if we're looking at a headless application, there's kind of two options of creating how you create a headless application. You can either use the create Sitecore JSS npm command to scaffold the head application locally, or if you're using XM Cloud, you can use, when you're setting up the project, it allows you to use the starter kit, and it'll create a new project through XM Cloud and push it to your Git repository. And so if you're creating a new headless application with create Sitecore JSS, today it defaults to Bootstrap 5 grid, which is okay, right? But again, because there's not really no out of the box components, and you're kind of bound into this. And if you're not using Bootstrap for the rest of your head application, you're only using Bootstrap for the grid process. With XM Cloud, the default is also Bootstrap 5. So this is something to keep in mind when you're creating new projects. And so you might be asking, George, what's wrong with Bootstrap 5? It's a library, it's tested, it's good enough. Why all the concern? So again, like I was saying, kind of the regular legacy, as SXA, a lot of the out of the box components were using Bootstrap CSS classes anyway, so you were loading in that CSS for those components anyway, so it was less of a big deal. But if you're not using Bootstrap for your components and for your CSS, you're basically loading only the Bootstrap library for just the grid, which the downfall of that is that Bootstrap is just the CSS part of Bootstrap that gets loaded in is really heavy. It's 223K of CSS just to be able to support grids on your pages, which is a lot of CSS just for grid support. That's before your actual styles on your page. And so it's not very efficient for your end user to have to load this with every page. I know there's cache and CDN and all that stuff, but still 223K is a lot. And we're here to build more efficient, more optimized websites, right? And so what are our options? We can either use one of the default grids and then use all our components to use that CSS library. So you can just build all your CSS on Bootstrap, and then you kind of abstract away a lot of that weight, just kind of live with the 223K total for your application. You can use another one of the grids and use that. You can create your own custom grid definition and use that instead, and just keep this grid styles you want. Or the third option is you just don't let the content authors resize anything. If you just take the grid away from them and just don't let them resize anything, then you don't even have to worry about it. But we don't want to be mean to our content authors. We should take care of them. So let's take the third option away. So let's say we're using one of the default grids, right? And we talked about the Bootstrap 5 grid being pretty heavy, but what about the other ones? So the other frameworks, Foundation, Grid 960, they're older, but they have a similar problem of pulling in a lot of CSS. For a lot of CSS, but you only use a tiny amount of it for the grid support. So you're thinking, well, Tailwind's new, right? And it's got the utility classes and everything. It's a modern framework. It's got to be a lot smaller. And you find out, like, if you look at the Tailwind CSS file that comes along with the grid support, in SXA, if you look at the theme, the Tailwind grid theme, in CSS, is 759K, which is 3 times more than Bootstrap 5 already, which is even more. So if you're choosing to use Tailwind as your grid system, it's actually an even worse idea. So it's a lot of CSS, especially if you're not using Tailwind for other things. So the second option was, let's create our own grid, right? And so if anyone's ever tried this, you'll know that this is not an easy task. But basically, you have, the idea is that if you create your own grid, you can just dictate the classes that you want. You define those classes, and then and then you'll have just a CSS class of just your classes, of just the grid classes. But this means there's 294 items in the content tree that you'd have to manage, and then assign all the corresponding classes. You'd have to test. It's a lot of work, and it's probably not worth the effort just to kind of maintain a grid. So if your Spanish isn't very good, this little girl saying, well, why not both? And that's exactly what we can do. And the foundation and the secret of how we're going to make it work with both is this idea of tree shaking. And so ChatGPT explains it as tree shaking with CSS is a technique to optimize style sheets by removing unused CSS rules from the final output, reducing the file size, and improving load times. So basically what happens is at build time, the compiler is smart enough to figure out what styles are being used and what are not. And then when it generates the CSS, it only generates the classes that are being used. So I'll give you an example. So this is that same component we kind of saw early on. I don't know how much you can see of this tiny text on the right, but it's the same component we had early on in Tailwind. And on the left, you'll see basically every unique class that's in that component. And this is just the one component, right? Every unique class in that component. And there's, I think, 16 of them, right? And so each of these classes may only be 1 or 2 lines of actual CSS properties, right? And so each of these classes are actually quite small. In this example, it's maybe just a couple of kilobytes across all 16 of these CSS classes. So while Tailwind supports, I think, like 2,000 different classes that you can use, when you tree shake this, it doesn't keep all 2,000 classes. 2,000 classes winds up with your 750 something K of CSS. But you don't need all 2,000 classes. Your component is only using 16 of these 2,000. So what tree shaking does is it shakes out all the other classes that are unused and it generates your CSS with only the 16 classes that are being used. And so it results in a much, much smaller CSS file as your output. So let's use this to our advantage. Basically, whether we're using Tailwind in our application or not, we can generate, we can use the Tailwind, the out-of-the-box Tailwind grid in SXA, so we don't have to create or manage anything there. It's already pre-done. It's already in. Sitecore provides it. That grid theme in SXA. We don't have to build it out. We don't have to manage 264 different classes, but we need to generate that. We need to generate that file of grid-related CSS classes, and we can use tree shaking here. So basically, we can use the safe list, what's called the safe list functionality in Tailwind, to make sure that we're keeping all our grid-related classes. If you're using Tailwind in your application already, then great. It'll basically tree shake out everything that you have in your components. But you want to make sure that you're keeping all your grid-related classes as well, because you can't really foresee, how a content author is going to be using the grid, whether they're going to make their component 6 columns wide or 8 columns wide or 10 columns wide. So we can't shake all of them out. You have to keep all of them in there so that all those styles are available to our content authors. If you're not using Tailwind, you're basically just keeping just the grid-related styles. So both ways work. You don't have to use Tailwind. We're just using Tailwind to generate our CSS file for just the grid-related classes. And so if you run the tree shaking, basically you wind up with the list of a CSS file with just the CSS classes to support the grid, which is a lot smaller. So if you remember our default Bootstrap 5 sizing. That was 223K of CSS to support the grid. But so once we've done the tree shaking yin tailwind and we've kept only the grid related classes, we're only down to 21K uh, of CSS, which is a 10x improvement, right? Which is quite a bit, especially this is code, this is CSS that's going to load on every single page. And so from a, this allows us to support the SXA grid with only 21K of CSS. You can still use any kind of CSS framework or methodology you want. You're not bound to Tailwind. This just kind of loads in as a separate CSS file. But you're able to support all the grid framework and without having to load in a whole lot of extra CSS. So everyone's happy. So in summary, in Headless SXA and in Headless applications, right, we've got a lot of different options for managing CSS that we kind of covered early on. You just need to know what the best one is for your use case. However, you want to make sure that you have the proper classes to be able to support the SXA grid. And so it's just something to be aware of. Be aware of that the default configuration when you create an application in a headless application in Sitecore or in XM Cloud, it's going to default to Bootstrap 5. Some of that can add a lot of extra weight to your pages that's not needed if you're not using Bootstrap 5. And we're all looking to build kind of optimized and efficient websites. So we have to make sure that we're optimizing for performance as best as we can, especially when it comes to CSS. There's a lot of performance benefits that we get with static site generation. With headless applications, there's a lot of performance benefit that kind of comes out of the box, but uh, you can add a lot of performance problems to offset that performance benefit if you're pulling in several hundred K of CSS and JavaScript and everything. You start losing some of the efficiencies of static site generation because your pages still take a long time to load because it's trying to load so much code. So something to be aware of, to optimize for performance. If you like to try kind of that Tailwind grid only configuration that you saw earlier, I put it in a gist in GitHub. And so you can use that tiny URL there to see how that configuration works. You'll notice if you click on there, you'll see a lot of kind of classes that are defined. And what we found out is that the Tailwind grid in Sitecore in SXA uses some classes beyond what Tailwind provides. They actually use quite a few custom classes as well. And so you'll see in that gist that there's the custom classes are added in kind of manually. There's a good handful of them, but it's not awful. But that was also included in that 21K number. So it's still very, very, very small. We're using this in production today. We've seen a lot of success with it. It's fast. It's taken our overall CSS amount of CSS down quite a bit as far as how much CSS gets loaded on a page. And so, yeah, that is pretty much it. There we go. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Appreciate you hanging with me, talking about CSS, and open to any questions or any comments that you might have.
Yeah, Josh, that is really wonderful presentation because I think people just get it like, okay, this is a small, this is bad, why so important? But this is really important because when you're reducing the lot of performance, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
very beautiful site and effective site. Like it is useful for the end users, right? Because it loads in a very quicker time than loading all the data. So I think that's
Yeah.
a really good insights into this ones. Okay, guys, any questions? I think you did share the URL of tiny URL. Right? I would like to
Yeah.
explore more on it.
Yep. It's right here. Yep.
Okay.
So all the files are in there. I think there's a CSS file that you'll need to add in, and then also the Tailwind configuration file. And so Tailwind has its own configuration. So when you load in Tailwind, you can drop that section into your Tailwind configuration file. The next time you build your site, it'll automatically do that tree shaking for you and generate your small CSS file.
Okay. I'm learning something new today. That's really, really great. Thank you so much, George.
Of course.
Yeah. Guys, anyone open to questions? If not, we are good to close the meeting today.
Well, I do have one suggestion.
Sure.
It's just that anyone who's recording the meeting, when the recording ends, please make sure you remove the expiry from the video.
Expires doesn't like your the timeout, right? Are you
Yep.
talking about
The,
the timeout, right?
yeah, the
Oh,
expiration of the video. The video has an
no, no,
expiry date.
no,
You can
no. You
remove
would
it.
be able to, yeah, sorry. You would be able to go and find these YouTube in the YouTube slash @ Sugh Hyderabad, where you'll get all the YouTube videos of the Sugh Hyderabad meetings. Okay.
Thanks, then. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, Josh. That was really great session and
Of
a
course.
wonderful opportunity for Sugh Hyderabad team as well. Thank you all. Bye. Have a
Thank
great
you
day,
for your
everybody.
time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.